and suffocation, boys and ghouls. And welcome to another edition of Coldcast, the podcast for all of us. And we're going to continue our spectacular, ghoulish October theme of Coldcast episodes here. And we have got a very special one lined up for you today. I'm going to talk about something that's really, really near and dear to my heart. I am a huge fan of this. I love the history of it. And instead of that, let me just play you a little something. Oh, what's that? You know. If you know, you know. You can just dance around right now. You haven't figured it out by now, kiddos? We're talking Tales from the Crypt today. Oh, yeah. And for those of you who don't know, Tales from the Crypt was a horror anthology TV show that was on HBO from 1989 to 1996-97. And it was actually based off a comic book, believe it or not. Man, just that right there, that score. Danny Elfman, who's a genius, as we all know, killed it. Killed it with this score, man.
From the Crypt.
Oh, I couldn't resist, man. I had to. Once you start, you can't stop with that theme. So today we're talking Tales from the Crypt, and before we get too far involved, I mean, once again, you guys know me by now. You know I'm a history buff, if you will. And with Tales from the Crypt, part of the reason I love it so much is because it's got such a rich history. I mentioned before is actually based off of comics, so I think that's really where we have to start with this. And I mean, you have to literally go all the way back to the 1930s, believe it or not. And you have to go with one of the first comic books ever created. Was All American Comics, and it was published by Max Gaines. Now, he started up his own comic book company called EC Comics, which stood for Educational Comics at first. And essentially, it was just that. So it was comics that was based off of stories from the Bible and history and whatnot. And as you can imagine, that was not nearly as appealing to children. So what did he ended up doing was they changed it from educational to entertaining comics, and they did more stories, the funnies, if you will. They did westerns, stuff that was popular in that era. Now he had a son who we're going to be talking about, and who is credited as the father of Tales from the Crypt, and that would be William Gaines or Bill Gaines. So pretty much what happened was Max passed away in 1947, and that is when pretty much his son Bill took over. And at the time, their business was just it was just drowning in debt, and nobody was reading any of their books or anything they were putting out. So Bill was very reluctant to go into the family business. He didn't really want anything to do with it. But it was just the family's like, hey man, we need you to do this. So he ended up just kind of deciding, you know what, I'm going to do comics that I want to read. And a big component of their success was when he was introduced to an incredible artist and comic book writer, and Al Feldstein. And Bill had like a huge interest in horror, which was something that wasn't really seen in comics at that time. And so Al drew up some drawings for him and stuff, and it was just like it's so iconic to this day. I can picture it, guys, right in my head right now. Just ghoulish looking creatures with like the saliva kind of like dripping down or like being accentuated or something, just insane, incredible art, in my opinion. And a lot of people agree with that too as well. So those guys get together pretty much, and they started off with 3 books: The Crypt of Terror, which would become Tales from the Crypt, Fault of Horror, and then Crimes of Suspense. And this is what was cool about it, is they were inspired by kind of the radio shows back in the day, like Lights Out and stuff like that, where it would be like a horror story told over the radio. Which, to our younger audience out there, you're probably like, huh? but yeah, there was a thing called the radio, and that was your way of entertainment. But I'm not going to get into that. I digress. See what I did there? You got it. So, yeah, they had those 3 books, and the cool thing about it, man, was it was ultimately good versus evil. And like what I loved about it still to this day is the endings was always a twist ending where evil would always get its upcomings or comings ups, if you will. I can remember there was like I don't know, there's one story like with the dude who was like a butcher, and he sold expired meat or whatever to his customers, right? And ends up his kid's over at some friend's house or something, eats some of that expired meat. Kid gets sick and dies, and then the wife kills him. Stuff like that. So, yeah, and also a big part of it too was a lot of funny puns, if you will, horror puns. Just like as we opened up this podcast, as well as stuff like I digress. You get it. You get it. I don't need to explain it. You get it. But yeah, a lot of puns, and then they also had a big part of it was having a narrator. So pretty much they had the Crypt Keeper, which is who we all know, had an old witch, and the Vault Keeper, and it was like I can remember the imagery of it still to this day, just like the really big bugged out eyes and stuff, man. Just real trippy stuff. So, anyways, yeah, it was horror with humor in a sense. So they pretty much kind of put all their eggs in the basket with horror stories, and it really brought EC Comics to the forefront. And I mean, they were really the innovators of horror comics. And then every other comic company pretty much at the time starts doing it. And it just blew up from there, and it was always like short stories too. One of the somebody who really needs to get a lot of credit was for a lot of the stories was an author, short story author, Ray Bradbury. And he used to write all sorts of little short stories, and EC adapted a ton of his work. And then you've got other artists too that came along, like Graham Ingalls, who kind of had that melting wax look, kind of like what I was talking about with the saliva, Jack Davis, and so on. Now, and what was also cool too is they were so ahead of their time, because they touched on stuff from like anti-Semitism to racism and I mean other adult themes. And they did this, guys, in the 50s. That's unheard of in comics. And then what a lot of people will remember EC4 other than Tales from the Crypt is going to be Mad Magazine. They launched Mad Magazine, and that was in the 50s. So EC Comics is going on all cylinders at this point. And then a douchebag asshole doctor, Dr. I believe his name was Dr. Worthram. Anyways, he put out a book in 1954 called Seduction of the Innocent. And that is pretty much where they launched like a big old subcommittee against comic books polluting the youth. And that, of course, is where the Comics Magazine Association of America came into effect. And unfortunately for EC, like a lot of their stuff, man, they couldn't get published because it was still too graphic by their standards. And they nitpicked the shit out of the comics, too. It was just ridiculous. But thankfully for EC, they still had Mad comics to fall back on. Which I should backtrack here and say they started off, Mad was a comic book, but then they ended up switching it over to a magazine format. And part of that was because they didn't have to deal with this bullshit with the Comic Codes Authority of America. So, pretty much, they were still pushing the boundaries, if you will. And then they were still putting out stories, but then they just kind of just said, you know what, we can't get by with doing horror. So then they were doing more like sci-fi stuff along with some Western. And as you can imagine, those books, they just didn't sell. And then the last comic they did was a sci-fi tale called Judgment Day. And this is a really, if you've got this out there, man, like this is kind of one of my white whales. I've always wanted to have this comic, but I'm sure it's an outlandish price. But it's really cool. So it's this book pretty much. In it, a space traveler goes to a dude in space, like is on this planet with robots, and they're orange robots, and I believe brown robots. I want to say, or a different colored robot. But anyways, they were talking about like how the orange robots were like in a different class than the others, yada yada. Anyways, it was obviously it was kind of a statement against racism, especially back in those days when it was still very prevalent. Well, anyways, the ending of it, the astronaut guy ends up like removing his helmet, and sure enough, it's an African American. And I guess the comic code with the authority was like, oh no, you can't have a black guy in a which is just freaking ridiculous if you think about it nowadays. But then again, this is that time, this is that era. And then pretty much at that point, Bill Gaines, they just said, you know what, fuck it, we're out. Deuces. So that was kind of a brief synopsis. I mean, it's a very rich history of Tales from the Crypt. And I mean, it is a huge part, I believe, of the horror community. And really, there is a lot derivative that come from that, especially like the short story narrative, like anthology series, kind of like you see with Creep Show and all these other different. I'm leaving some out, I know, but anyways. That's just like I say. That's just kind of a brief history there of EC Comics. Now on to what we all know and love, along with the comics, of course, but Tales from the Crypt. So, what happens? How did this get started? Okay, so Joel Silver, who was a famous movie producer, still I don't know if he still makes stuff, but I think. I don't know. You know what, though? You could always. What Wikipedia that shit? I'm sorry, guys. I had to get him one. So, yeah, Joel Silver, who produced in the 80s, like, big movie, like, he originally produced Alien, and the Lethal Weapon series and whatnot. So he ended up getting the rights to Tales from the Crypt. And he had a lot of different producers and whatnot that was interested in the show. You're talking guys like directors like Robert Zemeckis and Richard Donner, and who are great and phenomenal filmmakers. And they were going to originally do like a movie, but then they decided, you know what? There's just so much a rich history and content here and stuff that they're like, no, man, we're going to turn this into a TV show. And the cool thing is they had a platform to do it where they could pretty much get by with whatever, no censorship, if you will, by teaming up with HBO, home box office. And if you look back in the history of HBO at this point, I mean, they had a couple shows, but this by far, Tales from the Crypt, was their first big show. I mean, shit, this is the at that time, Tales from the Crypt was I'm pretty sure it was the very first HBO show that was actually ran in syndication, which is, by the way, how I discovered it myself, because we didn't have HBO and I had to sneak it in because it would air on Fox on Saturday nights at about 1 in the morning. So now, granted, it was edited and toned down, but still, I got that's how I got really introduced to Tales from a Crypt as a kid. But anyways, so they were going to originally do this as a movie, and then they decided, we got a series here, and it would go on for 93 episodes. And this is what the really cool thing is to me. Each episode was based off a story in the comics. And in my opinion, I think it's the one medium where it was true, authentic adaptation of the comics. In a sense that, like, there really wasn't anything that was done differently, I mean, it stayed pretty true to the comics. I mean, and you're gonna be hard pressed, one, to find anything that lasted that long and was that you know true to the comics. So 1989, a good year. So that is when Tales from the Crypt debuts on June 10th, and it aired with its first 3 episodes. And something Tales from the Crypt always did too, if you look back on each season, which are 7 seasons, their season premieres, it always would be 3 episodes they would air in a row. So the very first 3 episodes, the very first one that actually got directed was a episode called All Through the House, and it was directed by Robert Zemeckis, and it was pretty much the episode where lady kills her husband for whatever reasons, or I guess she's got a lover or something. She's like, she calls him up on the phone, says, I finally did it. And of course, this is on Christmas Eve, and there's some psychopath that escaped from a nearby prison who, I guess he got out by donning a Santa suit. So it's like pretty much the dude's like in a Santa suit with an axe, shows up at this girl's house. So yeah. But there was that one. The Man Who Was Death was a really good one, and I believe technically that is the very first episode, and it's a really cool episode in that it was about a guy who was run an electric chair, and the guy was played by William Sadler, which is an incredible actor. It had a lot tied in with Tales from the Crypt over the years. But anyways, he pretty much loses his job because they discontinue doing the electric chair in his state he's in. And so then he takes it upon himself to exact revenge on those who he finds that get proven that they're not guilty, but in fact they are guilty. Well, anyways, long story short, he gets caught and gets arrested. And sure enough, at that time, they reinstate the death penalty. So, and then he gets electrocuted. Ta-da! And then the third episode was a Dig That Cat, He's Real Gone, which starred a very young Joe Pantalone. And he plays a homeless guy who a doctor ends up um, giving him some money to do a test where he extracts a cat's DNA or something and puts it in him, thus giving him 9 lives. And so then he like goes to work for a carnival. It's like a sideshow attraction. Anyways, long story short, he gets like corrupted and ends up he ends up thinking he's using his last life when in fact he doesn't have any lives to give. So those were the first 3 episodes, man. They knocked it out of the park. Um, so pretty much, so from there, the first season was only 6 episodes, and then after that, it just took off like gangbusters. I mean, this attracted so many people. You got a lot of directors that were attracted to it because it's like they always wanted to direct horror, but they never necessarily could because they would be kind of pigeonholed into doing horror stuff, right? So you had all these directors kind of come in, and it's like, oh, you know what? I can do an episode of Tales from the Crypt and still have my do my regular thing. So it was a cool outlet in that way. But I mean, I want to kind of read a rundown here of just different actors who appeared on the show. I mean, listen to some of these top stars at the time. I mentioned William Sadler, Leah Thompson, Billy Zane, Dan Aykroyd, Kirk Douglas, um, Malcolm McDowell, Patricia Clarkson, Patricia Arquette, Demi Moore, John Lithgow, Tim Curry, Bill Paxton, Bob Hoskins, Anthony Michael Hall, Martin Sheen, Christopher Reeves, Judd Nelson, a young Brad Pitt, Blythe Danner, Joe Pesci, um, Timothy Dalton, and even Humphrey Bogart. That's right, I said that. We'll explain how that happened. And I also have popular TV stars that appeared on the show too from back in the day, like Harry Anderson off Night Court, of course, Katie Seagal, who we all know was Peggy Bundy, um, Richard Thomas from the Waltons, old John Boy, John Aston, the original Gomez from Addams Family, George Wendt from Cheers, Steven Weber from Wings, Terry O'Quinn from Lost was on there, in an episode, Hank Azaria from The Simpsons. And then you had some like really popular stars who kind of made brief cameos in episodes, like Michael J. Fox, Tom Hanks, Arnold Schwarzenegger, Whoopi Goldberg, um, and there was also a lot of great dynamic actors, like I mentioned, Joe Pantalone, Jeffrey Tambor, um, Bruce McGill, who's an incredible actor, James Rimmer, John Glover, Lee Arenberry, who some of you may remember from the episode of Seinfeld in the parking issue with George, where he's parking outside of Jerry's apartment to go watch a big boxing fight. But anyways, an incredible actor, Brad Dourif from One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and several other films. Miguel Ferrer, who actually did 2 episodes, starred in 2 episodes of Tales from the Crypt. Another one who did that was Michael Ironside. And there was also some stars that got discovered too, like Tim Roth's first real role was in Tales from the Crypt. And then you had guys like Ewan McGregor and Daniel Craig and Steve Coogan. A lot of comedians did Tales from the Crypt. You had Don Rickles and Bobcat Goldthwait and John Lovitz, Buck Henry, Rita Rudner, Richard Lewis, Sandra Bernhardt, Eddie Izzard, so on. Even like musicians and sports stars, like you had Iggy Pop, Morton Downey Jr., Sugar Ray Leonard, Heavy D was on an episode, Greg Allman, Meatloaf, Isaac Hayes, Wayne Newton, Travis Trent. You get the idea, man. It was just like everybody and their mother wanted to be a part of Tales from the Crypt. And you also had some of those actors I mentioned actually directed, like Michael J. Fox directed an episode. Um, but yeah, Tales from the Crypt was such an incredible show, and it was big because of several things. But there's one thing you cannot that it had to have was that identifiable like character, somebody you could relate to it, and that was without a shadow of doubt the Crypt Keeper. And he was voiced by the brilliant John Kassir, who has done a lot of voice acting over the years, but I would say obviously the Crypt Keeper is his biggest role. He also was the voice of Buster Bunny. Just throwing that out there. But yeah, man, and I mean they ended up it become so popular. Hell, they did freaking. They had a Saturday morning cartoon. They had toys. There was like a Crypt Keeper like talking doll. Hell, they even had like a because it was the '90s, and you had to have shit like this. They had like a cheesy '90s like rap video with the Crypt Keeper in it. um, I think it's called Crypt Jam, but yeah, and like even they had like a badass pinball machine, which that's another white whale of mine. But the thing is, to me, is one, these shows still hold up to this day. Matter of fact, in my household, we always watch every October. We watch nothing but horror movies, but we always watch every episode of Tales from the Crypt. Um, and you've got two different fan bases from like the comics, who and from just watching the series. But the thing of it is, you would never hear from them say, "Oh man, this was so much better in the comics," or "Oh, this was so much better in the series." Like I say, man, they just hit it and nailed it right out of the freaking park, man. Um, the tail, and they also did have some spin-off movies. They did Demon Knight was their first one, which was an awesome movie, and I thought it was so apropos that it starred William Sadler, who was in the very first episode, along with Jada Pinkett Smith. Um, oh my gosh, I can't think of it. Not C. Thomas Howell. It's the guy who was on Wings as the dumb mechanic, and then like he was in Sideways, and he was in Sandman from Spider-Man 3. And I cannot believe I'm drawing a blank on his name. But anyways, he was in it. And Billy Sane, Billy freaking Sane, who he did an episode of Tales from the Crypt as well. And of course, Billy Sane's an incredible actor too. But the whole point of it is like Billy Sane plays like a demon who's trying to get like this flask that's got like the blood of Christ in it, and like it apparently keeps the demons from possessing people or some shit or something like that. I don't know. But anyways, so he just ends up they're in a chase, and they end up in a small town, and just chaos ensues. But Demon Knight's an awesome, badass movie. And I tell you what, it was even more badass about Demon Knight, in my opinion, an awesome soundtrack. You like seriously like if you do vinyl like me, get that shit on vinyl. It's a pretty penny, but man, great soundtrack. Now they followed that up with Bordello of Blood, which Bordello of Blood was okay, but not nearly as good as Demon Knight. So, and I'm sorry, man, but I'm gonna call it like I see it. And a big part of that is because of Dennis fucking Miller was the star. Dennis Miller was all right. Like he had his niche with his stand up and like his definitely doing Weekend Update on SNL, but I've never been a Dennis Miller fan outside of that. I don't really enjoy like any of his talk shows or anything like that. I definitely didn't enjoy his run on Monday Night Football. But yeah, just Dennis Miller was the star, and it was just kind of like, eh. But the premise is pretty much like, oh yeah, it also did have Corey Feldman in it, and Chris Sarandon was in it. I want to say. Anyways, so pretty much premise is this guy brings back the queen of vampires back to life, and they end up like opening up like a bordello with prostitutes of all these other vampires, and they bring these guys in and pretty much, they turn them. And like Corey Feldman is the little brother of the main actress in it, which she's got one of those faces I can remember, but I can't remember her name. But anyways, she ends up hiring Dennis Miller to find out about her brother. Stuff ensues, yada yada, and it pretty much ends with him. She gets turned into a vampire unbeknownst to Dennis Miller, and Dennis Miller becomes, or it's implied that he becomes a vampire. Now, I should add on there too, William Sadler is actually in this too, in the opening sequence with the Crypt Keeper, and only he's dressed as a mummy. But on the show, they recreated a scene where it's actually he's playing Death, which any Bill and Ted fans out there, William Sadler did play Death in Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey. But anyways, yeah. So they're pretty much like playing a game of poker, I want to say, and which is also based off of one of their more popular episodes, and we're going to get into that here in a little bit. But yeah, William Sadler was in the Bordello Blood. Now they were actually supposed to release a third movie called Dead Easy, and it was supposed to be set in New Orleans. Like the Big Easy, Dead Easy, you get it. And I guess it's about this dude who like had memory loss and like ended up in New Orleans, and some crazy shit goes down or something. But it never come to be. Now the show ended after 7 seasons. Now the last season, it's okay, but it's not nearly as good as the other seasons. So they just, to cut the budget, they actually filmed overseas in England, and there was only 13 episodes, but only 12 of them was shot over there. But the good thing that came about it, I think, is that there was a lot of English actors who we didn't know necessarily in North America who we got introduced to, including Bond, James Bond, Daniel Craig. The very last episode, Tales from the Crypt, actually, believe it or not, was an animated episode, and it was about the Three Little Pigs, pretty much, but with an adult spin on it, which was pretty cool. And Bobcat Goldthwait, who had done a previous episode, actually lent his voice talents and was a big part of that episode. But anyways, so after 7 seasons, they ended up, that was it. And but it still holds up to this day, and it's still iconic, and it's something still people talk about. And they actually were going to do a revamping of it, but it kind of fell through the cracks, if you will, because it was supposed to be Jordan Peele doing it. I believe it was for TNT, but it just didn't work out, And then, as they say, the rest is history. But man, for the 7 seasons it was on, man, they hit it out of the park. And like I say, a lot of that has to do with because of how they adapted the story so well, man, from the comics. And there was so much material to work with the comics. And I can't stress to you enough, if you've never seen the comics and I get it, you're not going to be able to actually find the originals unless you're paying a pretty penny, but I mean, there are like graphic novels out there and collections of Tales from the Crypt. I would highly encourage you to check those out. So, that being said, I want to get into that makes a baker's dozen. Oh, yeah. I had to have my own baker's dozen of top episodes. So, and there's a ton to choose from. This was hard, man. It was really hard just to narrow it down to 13. There was so many, which I'm going to give some honorable mentions before we get into the baker's dozen, okay? Now, I would have to say honorable mentions I got to give to I'm just going to start rattling some off here, okay? Um, the very first episode, The Man Who Was Deaf, incredible episode. The Switch was a good one from season 2, where this old dude ends up, he's trying to like get a younger girl to fall in love with him, and he goes through cosmetic surgery and stuff. Um, I would have to Corman's Calamity is a good one. That's about a comic book artist for Tales from the Crypt who draws things and it comes to life. Lower Birth is a very good episode because it ultimately talks about the origin story of the Crypt Keeper. Television Terror gets an honorable mention, and that's a good one that starred Morton Downey Jr., where he's like a shock jock um, TV host, and he goes in this haunted house and ends up like it really is haunted. Um, My Brother's Keeper is a good one about these two conjoined twins, and the one falls in love with this girl, and the other conjoined twin kills her, and they end up getting separated, and the conjoined twins, and the one dude gets pretty much sentenced to death for murder. On Dead Man's Chest is an excellent episode. It's about a dude who gets this tattoo, and the tattoo essentially comes to life. Um, King of the Road was a cool one, I thought, and that actually had a young Brad Pitt in it. And it's pretty much he's going around looking for this famous drag racer called the Iceman. And yeah, that's a good one. Uh, uh, People Who Live in Brass Hearses is a really kick-ass episode. Um, that one had Bill Paxton in it, and he plays him and his brother. End up like they're trying to scheme this ice cream man who does a shitload of business out of his money or whatever. Well, anyways, they kill him, so they thought. He was an actual conjoined twin too. And so they killed the one conjoined twin, but the other one is still alive, ends up killing them. And I guess he was the more evil of the two. And that one still sells ice cream with his dead brother attached to him. So yeah. The Pit was kind of one that I don't think it's talked about, and it's not like gory or anything. I just like the story elements of it. It's about these two guys who are doing who are really doing mixed martial arts before MMA was popular, and their wives are really the ones that are the two rivals that hate each other. So, anyways, it's like gets reversed where the women go into it and fighting each other, and the men kind of just sit back and watch their wives beat the piss out of each other. You Murderer. I want to talk about that one for a second. That was a really good one by Bob Zemeckis. And at the time that come out, that was with the popularity of Forrest Gump. So what he did was now if you guys haven't seen, which I'm sure everybody or mostly everybody's seen Forrest Gump. And if you remember at the time when Forrest Gump come out, it was so technologically advanced because the effects in it and stuff, like where they were able to put, dead people in it like Nixon and JFK and stuff. So they did the same thing here for this Tales from the Crypt episode. And this guy who had like a storied past gets having plastic surgery. And sure enough, is Humphrey Bogart. That's right, Humphrey freaking Bogart, who ended up on an episode of Tales from the Crypt. Something else, really side note here, that was really cool and badass about that show. The beginning of it, the intros, because like I say, the intro was always the Crypt Keeper coming on, telling about what tonight's story is going to be, kiddies. And that one, he's dressed up as Forrest Gump, and he's got a box of chocolates that's like little fingers, in it. And he's telling his story, and lo and behold, who's sat next to him? Alfred Hitchcock, the master of terror. So I thought that was pretty cool. And the last honorable mention I'm going to go with is the Third Pig, which is the last episode, the animated one. But that being said, let's get right into it. My Baker's Dozen, my top 13 episodes of Tales from the Crypt. of all time. Of all time. So at number 13, I'm going to do an episode from season 3. This is episode 11, and it's called Split Second. And it's pretty much about a lumberjacks. So these guys up in Canada, I'm assuming, who are like in this small town where they just pretty much it's a lumberjack town and they have a bar, And one of the waitresses at the bar ends up like kind of falls in love with the owner, but then he ends up being like a dick and she wants nothing to fucking do with him and she's thirsty for that D. So some young guy comes along and ends up um, romancing her. Let's put it that way. And he ends up, the owner finds out about that. Ends up pretty much, I think I can't remember. He harms him some way, but I think he blinds him, right? And all the coworkers like see this and they're like, "That's bullshit, man." And this kid was like very talented at like cutting trees and stuff. And they were getting ready. I guess they do like a contest in their camp or something like that. Well, anyways, they end up tying up the owner, and they tie up the girl too, and put them. I guess they like put them in these logs, these massive tree logs, but they hollow it out where their bodies are inside it. Right. Well, anyways, homeboy's blind and ends up like he's chopping away and just shit out of this like tree trunk or whatever, and it had the guy in it, and he gets sliced to pieces, and then he ends up getting the girl too. So, moral of the story is, don't be thirsty unless it's for D that you own or something like that. So, anyways, that is my number 13 split episode or split second. So we are going to stay in season 3 with my number 12 and go with an episode called Yellow. And this was the season finale of season 3. And pretty much what happens, this one actually stars Kirk Douglas along with his son, lesser known son, but Eric Douglas, and Dan Aykroyd is in it too. So, anyways, pretty much it takes place in World War I, and a general is bound and determined to prove his son is not a chicken shit, and when in fact his son is a chicken shit, wants nothing to do with being in the army or whatever. So then, he does like he puts him in charge of the group or something, and they're out in the battlefield, and he retreats anyways, gets his whole platoon pretty much shot up and killed. So, as his punishment, they've decided they're going to kill him. But the dad, or Kirk Douglas, tells his son, don't worry, we're going to fire blanks at when we kill you, or when we quote unquote kill you. So, comes to the day where he's going to get assassinated, and ends up, what happens is, they actually are real bullets in there. He lied to him. But the reason he did that, because he wanted his son to die an honorable way. So, there you go. So Yellow from season 3 is my number 12. My number 11 episode is from season 4, believe it or not. And it is an episode called Showdown. And this is a cool one, man. What I like about this episode is it's about a gunslinger who arrives in like a ghost town, pretty much. He doesn't know it's a ghost town at the time, but he arrives in town, and this dude like has killed all these other sons of bitches, along the way. Well, he's like in the bar, and all the people in the bar, like he doesn't realize it till after the fact, are all people he's killed. And it's like he doesn't realize like he's just been pretty much killed in a gunfight. And so there he is with like all of his victims. And what's really cool about how it ends is how it's like they're actually ghosts there, and then it shows it in present day, and they're talking about he's kind of like a Billy the Kid type of character. And they're talking about his legendary status or whatever and blah blah blah. But I thought Showdown was a really well done episode. And I don't know, man. It was a kick-ass episode in my opinion. So that was from season 4. Now, my number 10 episode. We're going to go all the way back to season 1. And it was the last episode of the 6 episodes of that season, is an episode called Collection Completed. And it is the story of this dude who retires from work. And I can't remember his name, but he was in a famous actor from like the 70s and stuff. And he was in, I remember him being in The Jerk as the guy who's shooting at Steve Martin. But anyways, he ends up retiring, and he's staying at home now with his wife. And his wife is like a huge, like crazy, she's like a crazy cat lady, but has all sorts of pets. Like it ain't just cats, it's like dogs and everything. So anyways, he retires, and like he's just a miserable son of a bitch. And he ends up like he's annoyed as shit by his wife and her craziness with like all the pets and stuff. So he ends up taking on taxidermy. And unfortunately he gets her most of her pets. But she ends up drawing the line and ends up killing him and stuffs him and turns him into a taxidermy pet, if you will. So yeah. I don't know why, but that's always one that's just even Savannah and I have enjoyed it. And not that we enjoy anything with the animals. I mean, that's kind of hard for us to watch. But just seeing that asshole get his up, just what he's got coming to him. So that's my number 10. Number 9, we're gonna go back to season 4, and it's an episode called Split Personality. So in this episode, stars Joe Pesci. And he pretty much comes across these 2 beautiful twins who are rich as fuck. I guess their dad was like an architect or something like that. Well, anyways, he ends up like saying he has a twin too, and he just pretty much more or less like wears a ponytail and changes his accent and shit. And it's just Joe Pesci at his finest. It's Joe Pesci. I mean, what a great actor. And ends up he gets caught, and the girls are like, well, we got to share him, but we don't like how we're sharing him. So they ended up literally cutting him in half, and like the girls each get a half. Yeah, pretty fucked up, but a great episode nonetheless. We talked about this one earlier. At my number 8 slot is And All Through the House. And once again, just a pretty kick-ass episode, like with Santa Claus, like a guy who escapes from prison dressed as Santa Claus, and it comes across this house where the wife had just killed her husband. And it's just ironic, you know. Once again, that ironic twist. She gets her upcomings, and at the end of it, pretty much, she thinks she's gotten rid of him, but her daughter, who is anticipating Santa coming because this is Christmas Eve, lets him in the house, and he's got this axe in hand, and he has this great one-liner where at the end he's like, "Naughty or nice," and then she just has this blood-curdling scream, which I guess that episode, actually, believe it or not, Bill Gaines had a big part of the creation of that episode. And he told the directors and everybody, you need a bigger scream. So, anyways, All Through the House. That's my number 8. Number 7, man, I love this episode so much. Number 7 for me comes from the 4th season, and it's called What's Cooking. And this one has Christopher Reeves and Judd Nelson and Meatloaf in it. And pretty much, like, Christopher Reeves is a restaurant owner, and his restaurant's nothing but squids, like squid stuff, which is, I'm a seafood connoisseur, but even that to me is kind of gross. But anyways, he ends up, like, Judd Nelson is working for him, and I guess he like has come up with a recipe, which ultimately is they're killing people and selling their meat. And this starts with Meatloaf. It's kind of funny, right? But with Meatloaf, ends up getting who is playing the landlord, and it's like for Chris Reeves, and he's like, "Oh, your past rent's due. You owe me money, yada yada." So, anyways, they kill him. They start selling the meat, and then Judd Nelson's going to turn on Chris Reeves, but they don't do so, and they end up befriending a cop who comes to see him all the time, and he decides he's going to retire and help them like continue their business without Judd Nelson, and they're just going to continue killing bodies and serving them to people. And it was just crazy to me too, to as a younger person, to see like Christopher Reeves, who I loved and adored and still do to this day, who you've known as Superman, doing something completely different. But that is my number 7. What's cooking? Number 6. We're gonna go back to season 1 and dig that cat. He's real gone. This is that episode, one of the first 3 that aired. This is the one with Joe Pantalone, where he gets the 9 lives as a cat. And I just love the fact that, like, number 1 is Joe Pantalone, who is fucking awesome. What a great actor. And, he pretty much, like I mentioned earlier, he gets this capability of having the 9 lives, and he gets killed in all these weird, horrific ways. And his last act that he's going to go out and have all this money for is like he gets buried alive. But as he's there kind of telling his story and narrating it, it's like, oh shit, I don't have any lives left. Get me out of here. But there's not a damn thing they can do, So that's my number 6. Now we're getting down to the nitty gritty. Number 5. This is from season 2, and it is called The Ventriloquist Dummy. Well, if you diehards out there, you probably already know what the hell I'm talking about. So, this one stars Bobcat Goldthwait and Don Rickles. And it's about, Don Rickles plays a famous puppeteer, and Bobcat discovers him as a kid and pretty much grows up to idolize him and wants to become him. But a horrific accident happens, and Don Rickles' character is never seen again till Bobcat hunts him down. Because he's like, hey, I'm going to become a ventriloquist. And of course, this happens like 20 years after the fact. And Bobcat is doing his own thing, and he's failing miserably. He's trying to get his secret from Don Rickles. And ultimately, Don Rickles' secret was his twin brother was attached to his hand. It was like this crazy little mutated Murray. Oh, Murray, no, the blood is for women and blah, blah, blah. Anyways, ends up Murray kills Don Rickles, and because he wants to take over, he wants to get all the dames. So he cuts a deal with Bobcat to help him with his ventriloquism, and he ends up attaching himself to Bobcat's hand, and yeah, this is crazy shit, man. Just watch the episode. Number 4 gonna be an awesome episode. This one's from season 5. Death of Some Salesman. Fucking great episode, and I'm gonna give you 2 words as why it was great. Tim Curry. Let me tell you something. Tim Curry is a freaking national treasure, man. Such a talented actor. Everything he does, it's like touching gold. I mean, Tim Curry is the man, in my opinion. My God, that guy's body of work is just insane. But so, Death of Some Salesman, pretty much, and it has Ed Begley Jr. in it too. But pretty much, Ed Begley Jr. plays a salesman, and he's like selling all these funeral plots to people, but he's like ripping them the fuck off. So he comes across this house, and this is what was great about this episode. Tim Curry played the father, the mother, and the daughter. And all 3 completely different characters. And just with the makeup and stuff, it was just over the top. Ultimately, it ends up they capture the sale. It ends up like Ed Begley Jr. goes to the wrong house because they tend to lure salesmen in and kills them. And that's kind of what happens here. So that's my number 4. Now we're really getting down to it, folks. Now we're going to go with our top 3. And at number 3 is going to be a great one from season 2, For Crying Out Loud. And this is an episode where it has, oh my goodness, I already forgot his name. The guy I mentioned from Seinfeld. Lee Ironberger. There we go. Anyways, he plays a Harry Slash concert promoter, and he ends up like having this Save the Rainforest concert thing. And pretty much he's going to take all the money off of that and retire, and it's a shitload of money. But anyways, he goes. It starts with him. He goes to see a ear specialist because he keeps having this voice in his head. This is the best part, man. Guess who the voice in his head is? Sam Kinison. So I would hope most of you know who Sam Kinison is, but for those of you who don't, Sam Kinison, phenomenal comedian from the 80s and the early 90s, who was mostly known for I'm in your head now. You stupid fuck, you fuck, that. But anyways, so Sam Kinison is the voice in his head, and Katie Skulls on this episode too. She's his banker, and she's onto his scheme, and she demands to get half. Well, he ends up like pretty much killing her, and then a cop comes just because the nightclub's got like too much noise. Also, by the way, this episode has Iggy Pop in it too. This is a loaded episode. So anyways, ends up like his conscious, Sam Kinison, is like he thinks people can hear him because everybody's looking at him really weird and shit as he's going throughout the trying to get away, right? So anyways, he ends up confessing to the murder and what he did and everything in front of everybody. And in reality, they couldn't hear the inner monologue with him. It was just he had a damn Q-tip shoved in his earlobe. So that was yeah. So, and then ultimately he ends up rejoicing as he gets the electric chair and he finally gets fried and dies. But he doesn't have to listen to Sam Kinison anymore. Number 2, Carrion Death from season 3. This was a cool one because it takes place in the desert, and it's about this convict who escapes, robs a bank, has a highway patrolman chase him out to the desert. Anyways, he ends up, and this is kind of, I guess, in the near the Mexican border. So he ends up killing the cop, but the cop actually handcuffed himself to him. So now he's got to carry this dead body all over the desert, and he's trying to be an intuitive and try to get out of away from him. And he ends up like going to chop the cop's hand off because he finds like a rock and he chisels or something, and with the sharp edge and puts a handle on. Anyways, he goes and he accidentally hits his hand. Well, the whole time this is going on too, there's a vulture like following him and shit, right? So anyways, he chops his hand off accidentally, or he starts chopping off, and it's bleeding and shit, and he gets it snagged as he falls down or something off of a rock or something, and his whole hand gets ripped off. He falls on a rock. This is the criminal, by the way, and he ends up being paralyzed. And the buzzard comes down and pretty much pecks out his eye. So, like, fuck you, buddy. But yeah, that was my number 2. All right, my number 1 episode of Tales from the Crypt of all time. It's a great episode. If anybody who's never seen Tales from the Crypt, I always tell them, like, all right, check this one out. It is Cutting Cards from season 2. And it's pretty much about these two guys who are rivals and gamblers. And they pretty much, what ends up happening is they get in a high stakes game of poker. Chop poker. And it's pretty much like each hand they play, they got to cut off a limb. But it stars Kevin Tiggy and Lance Henriksen, who are both incredible actors, man. They just can play complete polar opposites, but like extreme rivals at the same time too. Anyways, long story short, it ends up where they've played so much of the chop poker that all their limbs have been discontinued, and they're in a hospital and limbless, and they're playing a game of checkers. And it's they're playing like they're moving to the checker pieces with their noses. It's like they're still playing even though they don't have any limbs. So yeah. So that's my top 13. Tales from the Crypt. So ultimately, I need to wrap this up here. Um, but ultimately, yeah, Tales from the Crypts, man. It's just one of those. If you knew, you knew, man. It's just one of those things. I think that some people don't remember. It's kind of like off in the shadows, if you will. Which, by the way, shout out to one Shadow who's follows our YouTube channel, Cole TV. Which, yeah, got some good content on there, folks, and we're gonna have some awesome content this October. So stay tuned for that, as well as here on Coldcast. But yeah, I say, man, Tales from the Crypt is just one of those timeless things. It still holds up to this day. You can still watch an episode and like you're still highly entertained. So that's gonna do it for this episode of Coldcast. I hope you've enjoyed our trip down memory lane of Tales from the Crypt. I'm Jeremy, aka XLJ the OG, and I'll see you next time, boys and ghouls.